Okay, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Ashley. I appreciate the welcome and the introduction. We're really excited to be here this evening and be able to present to the Alberta land producers. So thanks for inviting us. My name, as she said, is Shauna Mellish, and I've been working with the Animal Health Emergency Management Project for about a year now. Working on raising awareness about the importance of emergency management in the livestock sector. And I'm actually coming to you from the East Coast today. I actually live in Prince Edward Island, and Mickey Shatosky, who is our project operation manager, is joining me as well. And she's actually based in Alberta herself in Cochrane. So the purpose of the workshop today is really to help you understand and prepare better for the impacts of emergency outbreaks or disease outbreaks or other types of emergencies that could happen in the sheep industry. If you, as Ashley said, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll have a chance for a bit of interaction as well. So if you have some questions then, but we're happy to have you ask those and do our best to answer them. I also want to thank Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation for their support with this project as well. Today we actually have Brad Anders from, he's the Director of Emergency Management Services, and Jennifer Hennison, who is with the Livestock Traceability and Animal Welfare section, and she works with premise identification, traceability policy, and also has been assisting during animal emergencies, most lately with the high path avian influenza. So they're going to be joining us today to share some of their perspective from provincial government's point of view and to help answer any questions that might arise as we go through the session. So this session really is a great opportunity to ask some of those questions, to our regulatory and also to your industry reps that are on this call. Those are the people that would be directly involved in responding in an emergency. So as you know, this session is being recorded, and we'll get into it now. The first question I have for you is, just by a show of hands, if you can use the show of hand features, how many people are familiar with the Animal Health Emergency Management Project? Is there any here who have, yeah, I see a couple of thumbs up there. Great, hands up. For those of you who may not be familiar, AHEM, or the Animal Health Emergency Management Project, was actually began in about 2016, and it's a project that exists under Animal Health Canada, and it's funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under their Agri Assurance program. And what we do is we partner with agriculture organizations and governments so that we can build emergency management awareness and try to better equip the livestock industry for disease-related sector-wide emergencies, but we've also evolved to look at other emergencies as well over time. So in part, AHEM has done this by developing consistent set of tools and standardized processes that we use with livestock industries, whether it's across the country, within a commodity, or across commodities within a region. Currently, we have about 25 provincial and 4 national partner associations, and we operate across 8 species groups. So tonight, we're going to explore a little more through the activities to help you understand some of the resources that we have available to help you in doing your own emergency planning and preparedness. So the remainder of our time here, like I said, we're going to focus really on preparing to respond to emergencies in your sector, in particular on serious animal disease emergencies, but we want to ensure that you will be better prepared to respond and help lessen the impact of, any type of emergency and serious animal disease outbreaks to your operation and to your sector. And so we're going to do this by introducing you to what emergency management is and try to help you improve your understanding of an animal disease outbreak and why we should be prepared. We're going to also show you some of the tools that we have that can assist producers and industry members in responding. And then we want to work through a bit of a scenario to discuss solutions and how to best mitigate the impacts and prevent further spread of an outbreak of an emergency serious animal disease outbreak. So ultimately, at the end of the day, our goal is to raise awareness of emergency preparedness and have you walk away with an interest in creating plans for emergencies on your own operations. So let's talk about emergency management and emergencies. So what is an emergency? Well, we know that's a serious unexpected situation that requires immediate action. And we can think of emergencies in everyday life, things like car accidents or say a tornado, fire. And agriculture is no exception to these. We experience these as well. It's unexpected situations that happen and that we have to address immediately in order to protect the health of our animals as well as to minimize the impact to our farms. And so we can think of examples like, BC had most of the emergencies last year, like floods and droughts and wildfires, but Alberta has experienced things like wildfires as well. In PEI, we most recently experienced a hurricane. And so that's definitely an emergency that we've been responding to from an agricultural perspective. Serious animal disease outbreaks are more specific to agriculture. So we can think of things like avian influenza, foot and mouth disease, or African swine fever. And these are examples of, an agriculture emergency that requires an immediate response in order to protect the health of our animals as well as our operations and our industries. But they're also considered to be the greatest vulnerability facing livestock industries because it has the potential to weaken livestock sectors, restrict Canada's trade relationships, and also ultimately undermine public trust. But regardless of the type of emergency that we have, it's not the emergency itself that we're actually managing. We manage the consequences of the events of the emergencies. So, while emergency may be nearly impossible to predict just by its very nature, the things that we can do to minimize and manage the impact of the event is what we focus on. So that's where emergency management is. It's the actions we take to mitigate, prevent, prepare, respond to, or recover from an emergency. And really effective emergency management and animal disease emergency management will help reduce that risk to our people, to our animals, help to contain the spread of a disease, and help to reduce the impact to an industry as a whole. Brad, I'm just going to ask you, is there anything else you might add in terms of what emergency management is from your perspective on the less disease size, more emergency response side?
I think for Alberta, it really is a case of, we have 4 or 5 major events every year, very regional, but there's always something happening. I just was doing a list. 2022 has been avian influenza. 2019, we had the large number of fires in the Northwest. 2017 bovine TB, and we have 30 to 40 tornadoes every year, depending on where you live in the province.
Yeah, so definitely experiencing emergencies in Alberta. And so it's important then really to take actions to mitigate, prevent, prepare, plan so that we're looking after the health of our animals, our people, and our sectors. There we go. So when we talk about why emergency management is important, in particular when it comes to agriculture, we know that agriculture is a major contributor to the Canadian economy. When we think of what agriculture provides, we're providing hundreds and thousands in terms of livelihoods and financial stability, millions in terms of food security, and in terms of the GDP, agriculture contributes billions of dollars. So when there's an impact to agriculture, especially in a livestock sector, it can have ripple effects throughout everything. We can think of the market interruption, for example, that was experienced during COVID. There's also a lot of risk in agriculture. When we think of farms, for instance, we think of rural areas and maybe feeling a little isolated at times, but the reality is we're more connected than we ever have been. There's a lot of movement of people, plants, and animals and equipment between farms, whether that's within a region, across the country, or even internationally. And every time that there's an interaction, it has the potential to introduce a disease, a serious animal disease, into our sector. Now, research has identified that Canada actually has most of the risk factors that are associated with a large animal disease outbreak. So these are things like high density areas. When we think of southern Alberta, in Feedlot Alley, or southeast Manitoba, where there's a concentration of pigs. So anytime there's like a concentration of animals, there's potential for a broad spread of a disease among them. We also have a lot of movement that happens across Canada. Any given day, there's about 50 million animals that are on the road. And so as a result of that, there's a potential that if a disease is introduced, it can spread far and wide quite quickly. We also have a lot of commingling that we use when you think of like auctions or pre-sort sales or community pastures. And every time there's an intermixing of animals, there's the potential that a disease could move among those different herds. We also have an inconsistent application of biosecurity within and among species and across farms. So while there may be some degree of biosecurity on many farms, because there's inconsistencies, there's that opportunity for if something gets introduced that it could spread. So because of this, even though the probability of a serious animal disease might be small, because the impact would be large, and because we have high risk factors that would indicate a serious animal disease outbreak, the risk really is high that a serious animal disease outbreak could happen in Canada. So just to give you a sense of potential impact, what does that mean? When we think of something like a foot and mouth disease, we know that foot and mouth disease is a very contagious disease that spreads among sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and other animals. And so this was a study that was done back in 2001, but when we carry those figures forward to present day, it's estimated that if we had a large-scale outbreak of a foot and mouth disease or a serious animal disease like that, it would be a cost of $65 billion, billion. And even at a small and medium scale, it has a significant impact. If you want a real-world example of, the impact of foot and mouth disease, we just have to look about 20 years ago back to the UK, where they had a foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001. And what that resulted in was the depopulation and disposal of over 6 million sheep, cattle, and pigs, as well as an economic impact, initial impact of $9 billion. And, and those impacts didn't just end immediately, they definitely carried on over time. So, the take-home message really is that just because we don't have a serious animal disease right now, knock on wood, there's always that chance that a disease could be introduced. And what steps have we taken to both prevent it from coming into Canada, but preparing so that if it does, we can contain that disease and limit the spread and protect our operations and our sectors. Now, animal disease emergency management, it's similar to emergency management. Emergency management really has about 4 phases, and those you saw kind of on that previous slide. We talk about prevention and mitigation, planning and preparing, response, and then recovery. When it comes to animal disease emergency management phase, it's a very similar time in that, prevention and mitigation. But where we have a couple of additional phases is an alert, where there's an unusual animal health event that has been reported, and it kind of gets our attention and kind of makes us more aware. Maybe we want to take some actions like raise our biosecurity. In suspicion, it's when a serious animal disease is suspected. So it's moved from being aware that, there's something to be concerned of in the world, but it's not here to, we suspect that there's actually a case of a serious animal disease. Confirmation is just as it says, some testing that confirms that that disease exists, and then it moves into response and recovery. These phases can move through at different paces. Some can be more involved than others. But as we move through these phases, it's important to know that there's going to be different individuals, different diverse skills and experiences and knowledge that will be required to ensure that we have an appropriate and effective response. The key players that you'll want to be aware of will be not only yourself as a producer, but also your farm veterinarians, your producer organizations, and then the various levels of government, depending on what is happening. If it's a disease that's regulated provincially, then your provincial government will be involved. If it's something that's regulated federally, then CFIA and federal regulatory authorities will be involved, but also your provincial government will be involved in the response as well. So, what is important to do is really to work on building those relations in advance. That's really key because, if we learn how to operate together, how to communicate together, then things can go move more smoothly and more efficiently as we work our way through these highly stressful situations. When we're in these high stress situations, it's not really the time to be trying to develop an effective working relationship with someone. If we can do that in advance, we'll just better be prepared to move through effectively together. Brad, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms of emergency management phases or anything with this respect to this?
No, I think you've talked about it really well. And as we get into it, what you just described is what poultry owners are going through right now across Western Canada.
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, it's avian influenza is rearing its head again as we go through fall migration here. I think it's important that we just point out a little bit about the Emergencies Operations Center, or what we refer to as the EOC. So when there's an emergency or a sector-wide animal disease related emergency, what happens is the industry organizations and government officials will work collaboratively to ensure that there's a coordinated and effective response. And so this is done to both support the producers that are directly involved in a serious animal disease or an emergency, but also those that are impacted outside of that emergency in the case of a serious animal disease, those that will have market effects. So communication on actions and steps, that you as a livestock producer will need will come from both the industry organization that you're associated with, as well as the regulatory bodies involved. An EOC is it's established during an emergency response. And this diagram here just gives you a bit of an idea of what the structure and relationship might look like. And so you can see kind of, upwards is kind of that strategic decision making by government and livestock, but then there's also that support on the ground for that operational response from the livestock industries, provincial livestock associations as applicable, and government as well. So what you should know is that representatives from a producer organization would be involved in these discussions and make sure that your interests are they advocate, I guess, on your behalf for your industry. And they're also going to help with communication updates to producers and confirm things as they unfold. Anything you think would like to add there, Brad?
I think the key part, the government veterinarians are disease-centric, right? They're scientists and they focus on the disease. The impacts of movement restrictions, the impacts of different, what I would call disease management decisions, we really depend on your association to provide that feedback into the team so that we minimize the impact as much as possible from the disease outbreak. We don't know how all of the business works in the background. You guys do. So the best way for us to make sure that the disease response is effective, but not kind of over the top and causing extra damage, is to be engaged and have someone from the association embedded in with our team.
100%. Yeah. And I think that's where building those relationships in advance so that you have the right people in the right place doing the right communication is just going to help that much more in a response. So what is your role and responsibility then as a livestock owner or producer? First and foremost, it's for the care and well-being of your animals. If your animal is unwell, or you notice something or suspect something that's different in terms of a serious animal disease outbreak, your first point of contact is likely going to be your veterinarian. Now, your veterinarian should be familiar with regulated disease, both provincially and federally, and so they will do some gathering of information and assess animal health. And if it is something they suspect is a reportable disease, then they will contact the appropriate regulatory authority. So if it's a provincially regulated disease, they'll probably be in touch with the chief veterinary office, or if it's a federally regulated disease, then CFIA would be the point of contact. So your responsibilities as a livestock owner and producer, in addition to caring for your animals and working on, having a good relationship with your veterinarian, is having an emergency response plan for your operation. And not only just having a plan, but working to keep it up to date and sharing it with any farm personnel that you might be working with so that they are aware of how your operation intends to respond. Biosecurity is also the responsibility of the producer in your operation. Traceability is also important. And then mental health, as well as the safety of those around you. So today we're going to discuss those things a little bit and tell you about some of the available tools that AHEM has to support you in doing following up on these responsibilities. So before I continue, I'll just ask if there's any questions that anyone has that they want to pop in the chat or just raise their hand. Okay, well, we'll continue on for now. And by all means, if I'm talking faster than you can type, continue to put in your chat and we can always see those questions come up. So AHEM, the resources that we have are really for industry first aid. Our objective is to strengthen emergency preparedness, response, and recovery in livestock sectors so that we can minimize the impact of serious animal diseases if they occur. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the resources and tools that we have to support you in an emergency event. And recognizing too, going back to the fact that regardless of the trigger, you're managing the consequences. So a lot of the consequences of a serious animal disease and other types of emergency could be the same. And so preparing and planning is very important, and these tools can be used for that. All these resources are living documents. So there's something that we continue to update with new information and make available. So on our website, which Mickey has put in the chat for us, you can find them there. There's no cost to them. And we really encourage people to check them out, download them, share them, and make good use of them. So what we've done with our resources is we've worked with livestock organizations and governments to help build an emergency management resource that's going to support you as a producer, as well as industry associations and animal health specialists. And so what this has included is our national framework, and it's the one in the middle there. Our association plans, an example is on the top right. And then our producer plans, producer handbooks, which is the big one on the left there, an example of one. And that's probably what we're most widely known for. So the producer handbooks have been developed for 25 provincial partners over 8 provinces. And that does include swine, cattle, dairy, goat, sheep, and equine sectors. And our bison one, actually, we just received our printing of that, and that's going to be released at their meetings coming up. So there's lots of opportunity to check out those handbooks. Now, the handbooks, as I said, they're designed to assist you as a producer in understanding, preparing, and responding to an emergency event. AHEM has also evolved, as I mentioned, to help include high-level discussions on emergency management, such as floods, fires, and droughts. So in our most recent additions in the last 2 years, the things that we've started to incorporate have been things like maintaining your business operations and how to provide some, direction in terms of if you have the supply surplus issues, looking at other hazards and how to respond to non-disease emergencies like fires, floods, and power outages. And then also something about when to speak to your veterinarian. So highlighting some of the signs and symptoms that are key to monitor and know when to contact your veterinarian. Now, the association plans are designed more for the staff level at a provincial level to support them in a response. And then the national frameworks really is that they complement the producer level and the provincial level, but from a national standpoint. So these 3 types of resources, they contain the same principles and components to help ensure that we have a consistent response and application of protocols across commodities and provinces. And they also fit well with provincial and government response plans because, we've worked on developing those together. And so as a result, we can be efficient in our response because we can practice and perform them together and know that we'll all be working well together in an event should one happen. Now, in addition to some of our AHEM, these AHEM materials, we continue to develop other resources that industry requests. So we have this one on the bottom right, the Producer Summary Emergency Management Brochure. And the reality is with all of these, like I said, we're trying to make sure that we're supporting producers in a serious animal disease. Really 99% of the farms aren't going to have the disease, but they are going to be significantly impacted by it, whether it be by market interruptions or movement controls or things like that. So these resources, again, are there to help support the operation, whether you're directly affected or indirectly affected by a serious animal disease or an emergency. So this is an example of some of the newer resources that we have developed as well. We have this producer workbook. And so what the workbook does is it's an array of the customized tools and templates that we have that are also in the producer handbook, but removes kind of the descriptions and the context. It's just kind of that plan to work through and have as a basis for your operation to start developing an emergency management plan. We also have some early detection summaries, which give you kind of visuals as to some of the signs and symptoms of diseases of concern that you might want to look for. And then also suspected serious animal disease first 48 hours, what a producer can do. And we're going to discuss these a little more as we go. These tools, again, are built for industry, by industry, with all levels of government. So there's an incredible level of collaboration on them. And we want to help you understand how they are used and applied in an event like an animal disease outbreak. And so one of those ways we tend to do that with AHEM is doing scenario-based workshops, which is kind of what we're going to do now. We're going to work through a situation and show you how we would use those. So I do want to reiterate, we always like to say this, the scenario that I'm going to present is made up. It's not real. But we feel that it's a good tool to use to help you walk through a situation without having the consequences of the decisions that you make or the time pressures that might be involved in a real situation. It allows you to kind of, like any exercise, strengthen your capacity to respond. And every time you get a chance to do that, it better positions your operation to help mitigate the impacts of a serious animal disease outbreak or other types of emergency. Now, we do say that with our tools, we use them as resources and they do provide protocols and guidelines, but they're just that. Developing any type of emergency management plan, we encourage you to remain flexible. It's important to work through these what-if situations and develop materials and response plans for your operations, but know that in an emergency event, there's lots of variables, lots of different things that could happen, and so it's important to be flexible to meet that. And as well as you'll receive specific directions to an emergency that takes place from your livestock industry organizations, as well as your regulatory authorities. So what's going to happen is I'm going to kind of read through a scenario, and then I'm going to ask some questions, and I encourage you to unmute yourself or through the chat, provide some feedback, and then we'll show you how the tools could be used. So in our situation here, we have Kayla and David, who operate a mid-size market lamb operation located in central Alberta. And the lambs tend to be marketed into local restaurants in nearby communities. There's also, they have children and they're actively involved with the farm as well as 4-H. They have a couple other animals on the farm that they use, including pigs for their own use, 20 chickens, and a couple of horses. So on the weekend, the kids participated in a 4-H achievement day. And so they took their lambs and were showing their lambs. And on return, the lambs were looking good and alert, and they reintroduced them to the herd. So on Monday, as they're checking on the animals, they noticed that 2 of the lambs are limping. And they seem to be backed off their feed and aren't having the water intake that they normally would. And there seems to be a bit of drool. So if you were Kayla and David in this situation, what would you do? Does anybody have any offerings that they'd like to, unmute and tell me, what do you think you would do in this situation? I'll give it a minute. Producers' responsibility is for the care of their animals and being aware of potential diseases. And so, some of the things that might be considered by a producer is waiting another day to see if the symptoms begin to improve. I wouldn't have put the 4-H lambs back in the flock in the first place. That is an excellent answer. Yeah, that's a type of biosecurity. Lambs should have been quarantined. Exactly. So thinking about the biosecurity of the animals and keeping them separated to make sure they're healthy before they get reintroduced into the herd. It's great to know that there's some thoughts of isolating them. Looking for signs and symptoms, it's important to know that you have trusted resources and where to turn. There's Dr. Google, we can take a lot of ththings out there. Yeah, talking to my vet about what's happening and separating the lamb. And that's great, because if you have a good relationship with your vet, that's an excellent source and trusted source of identifying signs and symptoms that you might want to be concerned about. What we have is in our resources is a couple of things, I guess. First of all, is in the bottom center here, this detecting foot and mouth disease in cattle, but in sheep, in pigs, in goats as well. What this does is it gives you a visual of some signs and symptoms that you should be looking for, and some guidance on if you have 1 or 2 or 3 and 4, that there's maybe some danger there, and it warrants a call to your veterinarian to check on your animals and see if they're okay. We also have in the top right here, this falls within our producer handbook. What you can see here is kind of, again, key signs and symptoms, depending on, obviously you'd be looking at the handbook for sheep as to when you might want to call your veterinarian when there's things of concern that might want to warrant a call to a veterinarian. As well, we have on this top left corner, same kind of idea, some guidance on in an unusual animal event is taking place, some things that you want to kind of keep aware of and when to call your veterinarian. So one of the things I would stress here is the importance of having a good relationship with your veterinarian and communicating with them and making sure that they are aware of the common symptoms of serious animal diseases as well. The other thing is biosecurity, and we alluded to that with the quarantining the animals and keeping them separated before introducing to the herd. So biosecurity is something that we can use to both prevent, mitigate, and respond to an emergency. These are management practices that are used to prevent the movement of disease either onto or between agricultural operations. So biosecurity practices that you could consider implementing, like we said, is keeping those animals separate, observing them for a while before introducing them, ensuring that the animals were healthy before departure, that the other animals that they might have been exposed to, if you can be aware of their health status. And even if you're introducing animals into your own herd, not necessarily in this situation from 4-H, but, understanding what their health status was or is before you bring them onto your farm, and having, trusted sources and suppliers. Good biosecurity resource is on the top left here, this National Sheep On-Farm Biosecurity. And so what that is that there's government and industry organizations work together to develop this national standard, and basically gives you some guidance for, some basic biosecurity and guidance to develop a protocol for your own farm. On the right, this is, we've developed our biosecurity protocols based off these national standards. And what we have is kind of your green is your day-to-day biosecurity operations. Amber, that's something you would elevate to if there's something unusual happening that you want to be aware of. And then red is if something's been confirmed, the biosecurity protocols that would be put in place likely by your regulatory authorities. So, it just kind of shows you an escalation, I suppose. And then within the biosecurity protocols, we have it kind of broken down within the handbook as to moving on and off farm and things like that, so that you can think of the steps that you might elevate to. So thinking about if something's suspected or there's something unusual, do you want to consider restricting primary points of access or using visitor logs, which really is a good basic one, basis kind of green everyday one to use. Thinking about things like changing your clothing and footwear when you're entering and leaving a farm, or even ensuring disinfection. And I think COVID has taught us a lot about biosecurity, because these are a lot of the things we use to try to mitigate and prevent the spread of COVID in the last couple of years. So in our scenario, kind of bumping it up a notch, Tuesday they go out, they didn't initially call their veterinarian because they wanted to see what was going to happen. But when they go out, they see that there's more animals that are showing signs of lameness, lethargy, and off feed. So they do decide to call their veterinarian. And when their veterinarian arrives and does an examination, they notice that there's sores that are in the mouth as well. And so after discussing this with Kayla and David, the vet indicates that they do suspect that there's a foot and mouth disease. So in this time period, what do you think are some of the top priorities David and Kayla should take care of? CFIA is going to be contacted by the veterinarian. It's going to, they're going to come out and want to check this out, but it's going to be a few hours. So in that time period, there's two things, I guess, that I would want you to think about. One, is there additional biosecurity protocols that you might want to put in at this time? But two, what type of communication do you want to have at this time? Is there anyone you think you should be communicating with? And I'll just give you a second to think about that and see if there's something you want to add to the chat. Knowing the situation, I guess that the family was at a 4-H event on the weekend. Do you think that they should contact the 4-H leader or the events ground and let them know that something suspicious is happening? Or do you think that it would be better to wait? What would you do? Would you call your association? That would be one question, yeah. Or even your family and your staff, do you let them know that, hey, there's something suspicious going on here? So maybe keeping those people away from the animals. Great, yeah, good to see that that you would call, Jolene, that's great. Other 4-Hers, yeah, neighbors of animals is another good one. If potentially you have a pasture that borders with a neighboring operation, you may want to let that neighbor know what's taking place as well, so that they can maybe up their biosecurity in the interim while you try and figure some of this out. So in our producer handbook and our producer workbook, we do have this unusual animal health event initial response protocol. And again, it's a tool that gives you some guidance as to some of those things that you might want to do, like talking to your family members, looking for advice from your veterinarian, and identifying who the key people are within your operation to make decisions, and then notifying some of those external contacts that you've been in contact with. So what would happen at this point in suspicion is the CFIA is going to arrive, and as they do their examination, in our scenario, they do suspect that it's foot and mouth disease. So CFIA is now going to declare the farm as an infected place, and that means that they now have regulatory authority in terms of the Animal Health Act over the parts of the operation. So that means that there's not going to be any movement on or off Kayla and David's farm anymore, and they're going to look to begin some tracing operations. So things that they're going to be looking for as far as information is, visitor logs, maps of the premises, any movement on and off the farm in the last 30 days by both those visitors as well as animals. They want herd inventories and things like that, and then they're going to start setting up controls. They may also look to set up restrictions on premises that could be linked. So if your neighboring farm, if you share a pasture, a fence line, there may be restrictions on those farms as well. So what's going to happen as well is when they do their investigation, they're going to start taking samples and send them off for testing to confirm whether it is in fact foot and mouth disease or not. And that can take a few days' time. So you begin to be in this gray period. So in this gray period of trying to figure out what you're going to do, well, it's suspected and you're under this control and you need to provide this information to CFIA, David and Kayla are going to have to provide those movements, but as an operator, would you be able to identify the livestock movements on and off your operation in the last 30 days, as well as the visitors? And thinking about who's in your area, how many farms are within 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers that could be impacted by this quarantine that CFIA would set up? How would you go about identifying where those susceptible farms would be? So traceability becomes really important in this situation, and traceability is the ability to move those, monitor animals both forwards and backwards in their lifetimes. And kind of the 3 key pillars of that include animal identification, premises identification, and movement tracing. And the quicker that we can have this information, we can determine where a disease has come from, and then how far it is spread. I'm going to turn it over. Jennifer, do you have some comments for us on traceability and premises identification?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think I'm going to start on premises identification, which hopefully everyone here is familiar with. So it known as PID or PID, and it's a way of linking the livestock and poultry to a specific geographic location, or what we'll call the premises. And it's applicable to species of livestock and poultry, and it's required for a commercial operation with 300 head or a small acreage with 2 pet sheep or 6 hens in the middle of Edmonton. So premises identification number or PID number, that's the unique identifier assigned to that piece of land. And it consists of the 9 alphanumeric characters, and Alberta always starts with an A, and you might see an AB, an AA, or an AT. So I assume everyone here has a PID number, as it's required to purchase CSIP ear tags or things like selling at an auction. They should be asking you for that, or buying medication. And so the point about PID that I wanted to kind of emphasize is that why we ask you to register yourselves in the PID system. And it's so we know where your animals are in the event of an emergency in your area, be it an animal disease or an environmental risk like fire. Whether it is a location with animals on the farm, in a feedlot, being assembled at an auction, disposed of at an abattoir, or an on-farm slaughter operation, it's important to capture all of those premises. And one thing, it's important to remember that the information we use to prepare for, so to know where, say, all the sheep operations are, or to respond, is we use the information, the PID information that is provided by you in your PID account. So if you're grazing your lambs in a pasture 50 kilometers away from the home quarter you entered in your PID account, or your email address has changed, or you raise 10 chickens every year for the freezer, anything like that, it's important to update your PID account. If we don't know you have a new email address, we're going to send our notification to the old one. If we don't know that you have sheep in the area of risk, we can't notify you, because we don't know your animals are there. So that's sort of an important message is we need your contact information. And that's one thing that we've discovered actually with the avian influenza response is how many folks have assumed that, well, I bought this land, I just take over their PID number. Well, you kind of have to put your contact information, you have to have your species that are in there, because we don't know what we don't know. And that update of the PID system. And yep, the regulation is that you register 1 PID account in at least 1 premises, but the advantage of having the pasture or a site that you regularly are receiving animal from or sending animals to, having that PID information in there is important to capture. So in regards to traceability, I can do this really fast. If we're tracing something, so you have the diagram there in front of you. So as Shauna reiterated, that there's the 3 pillars of traceability. There's premises identification, so where the animals are, and that's a provincial responsibility. So you work with your provincial government to be registered and all of that. Then there's animal identification, so which animal is it? And it is federally regulated and varies by species. So as you know, for sheep, there's a list of CFIA approved ear tags, and where you purchase your CSIP tags, they follow that list. And then there's animal movement reporting. So where have the animals been, or who have they been in contact with, is what we're looking at. And movement reporting, it can fall under federal or provincial regulations depending on the species. So for sheep, there isn't, besides retiring a tag when it's slaughtered, there isn't any sort of traceability movement reporting required at this time. But we have the Livestock Identification and Commerce Act, or LICA, so you're using that livestock manifest to be moving sheep. It's not going into any database, but it's in your records. And so if you had to, in the circumstance, well, where have you been? Oh, you went to this premises identification number, for the 4-H event. And you can, that detail can help in a response. And eventually we are going to get the amendment of the federal regs, and there will be a requirement for movement reporting for sheep, more like if you're receiving animals. And having that go into a database, yes, it's paperwork, and yes, it's just one more thing to do, but time is of the essence in a response, and having that information quickly helps with that response. Having to sort through a lot of paper, it takes time. So I think that's where I'll stop. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's excellent. Yeah, that's a great explanation of that. And you're right. We put in the chat the link for premises ID for Alberta, so that if anyone who wants to click on that, if you haven't registered previously or want more information, you can click on that. One of the questions that's in the chat is that when you buy a property, do you get a new PID, or do you use the PID currently on the premises? And I think you kind of answered that in that, yeah, the PID is assigned to the property, not the person, and we need to update contact information.
Yeah, but if you're buying a new property, if it's been split, if it's been parceled, the PID number is based on an algorithm of the land title number. So if there's been reparceling, it may be a new PID number. If they had grandfathered a previous number for whatever reason, but you're new to it, you're not necessarily going to get that grandfathered ability. So if you're buying a new piece of land, or you're selling, or you're stopping, just call, phone, or just you can go online to your account too. And I do have a phone number. It's 780-422-9167, and that's gonna it is you might get a voice recording if it's really busy, but either Helen or Lucy will give you a call back and help you with updating your PID account.
Awesome. And maybe, do you want to just throw that number in the chat too, so that people can have that as well to record from there? That would be great. Thank you. Yeah, and as Jennifer said, traceability is key. In Alberta has used it, for instance, in the fires in Slave Lake. I believe it was used to help with plan evacuations. And I know even in Prince Edward Island, we use our premises identification system to reach out to producers, not only to provide, information in terms of avian influenza or African swine fever updates and things like that, but prior to our hurricane that we had a couple of weeks back, we reached out to all our producers that we had contact information for, to give them some information as to how to prepare for an emergency event, and to take measures to protect their animals. The other thing we would recommend too is that in our producer handbook and workbook, we also have sections, pages 5 to 14 in our producer workbook, that have things like a visitor log and contact information and work cycles, and things that you can kind of develop so that you have that information ready to provide as far as, the visitor side too, so you can track the movements of people on and off in the last 30 days, which also helps with that tracing. It also has a risk assessment guide in there too, as far as visitors, so that you can low, medium, or high the types of biosecurity that you want to apply to those visitors that might be coming onto your operation. In our scenario, and in real life, if it were to happen, what's going to happen is a CFIA, if they suspect something, they are going to notify the provincial veterinarian, and the provincial veterinarian may contact the Livestock Association too, just to say, hey, we've got a suspected case of a serious animal disease. Now, what's important to know is they, because of the privacy regulations, they cannot share any information about your operation if you're that operation. So David and Kayla, nobody knows that it's their operation. They just know that it's happening, that there's something happening suspicious somewhere. So, the questions we would want you to think about is, if you were David and Kayla, would you want information to be communicated to potentially susceptible farms or your sector? But then as an owner or producer, if there was information out there, if there was, some rumors circulating that there might be a serious animal disease, what kind of information would you want? And what actions might you take as far as increasing your biosecurity? Are you still going to accept shipments of animals, people who are coming to your farm to provide service, whether it's delivering feed or topping up your fuel? Are you going to ask them to disinfect before they come on and off your property? So some of these things to think about. Now, some of our advice too would be to look at, we have a notice of suspicion response protocol who gives you some guidance as to who, where, what would be involved and some specific responses that you could take. We also have this first 48 hours for producers. So it's if, you're told there's a suspected case of a serious animal disease on your operation, here's some immediate communications, biosecurity, and starting your own trace investigation that you may want to do. Because as you'll recall, you're in this gray period, right? So the restrictions that have been placed are placed on the operation that has the suspected case, but it's not going to be across the province, across the sector. So there's still animals that can move, and as animals move, if they've had interaction and could potentially be carrying that disease, then there's potential to continue that spread. So if CVAO may come to the livestock organization and request that producers consider stopping movement to help limit the spread of the disease and reduce the size and length of an outbreak. So one of the questions you might want to consider as an organization or producer is, would you consider doing a non-essential movement ban? And what steps might you take to protect your farm? Now, we do have a protocol for non-essential movement, and it kind of describes, again, the when, the who, the what, the why you might want to consider this, and then some of the how in terms of, considering dead stock or deliveries or maybe livestock that are already in transport. From our point of view, there's considerable value in trying to contain that disease early on. And by voluntarily ceasing movements, we can, reduce the spread of that disease and hopefully get a handle on that disease before it begins to spread more widely. In the handbook, you can see this here. We also recommend having your work cycle developed. And so that way, if you have it written down, first off, if you're that operation that is under quarantine or within that quarantine zone, there's going to be permits that are going to be required for anything that wants to move on and off your farm. So if you can more quickly provide that information to a regulatory authority, then they can start getting that permitting in place so that that movement can happen. But also for yourself, if you have written down what your typical work cycle might be, then you can also anticipate who might be coming to and from your farm and prepare additional biosecurity measures to have in place for those people, and also assess the risk that they might bring to your operation. So just being aware of time and going to continue moving this on. So after that gray period, so in those 2 or 3 days, we're waiting for testing. In our scenario, the CVO of Canada, so Dr. Mary Jane Ireland, comes back and says that we have a confirmed case of foot and mouth disease. And so what that means is that the borders are going to close. Poor David and Kayla are going to have destruction orders issued on their farm. There's continued tracing that's going to take place, and they're going to start trying to work towards establishing zone, similar to what you may be seeing in avian influenza right now in the response. And so this is a really terrible time, of course, for Kayla and David. They're going to get guidance from CFIA as far as depopulation, disposal, cleaning, and disinfection. But ultimately, they're going to be responsible for looking at having that done and following up on those actions. So as a livestock owner or producer, if you were in that situation, things you may want to consider is, am I prepared to do that? Do I have the equipment I need in order to depopulate my herd? How would I begin disposing of them? And who do I need to talk to make sure that I'm prepared with a plan for that? The reality, though, is, as we talked about earlier, 99% of the farms aren't going to have this disease, but they're still going to feel the impacts of that, of those borders closing. And so for those farms, it's important to be aware of the situation and how that's going to impact you and the things that you're going to need to consider. So as far as animals, are you still going to get shipments of animals? Or are you going to be more aware of where those are coming from and ask more questions about the health status, and are they from that area? Are you going to find another buyer? There's going to be potentially a market interruption, right? Because the borders are closed and now we've got a lot of animals that maybe domestically we can't handle. So how do you handle that market interruption? And in our workbook, we do have a couple of things too, the confirmation response protocol. So again, just some guidance as to an owner or custodian's response, but also, as I alluded to, some of the things we've added towards the end in the last couple of years is towards, business continuation and the questions you need to consider and develop strategies around for that. This is also a good time to talk about mental health, because mental health, not only, an emergency doesn't only take a physical toll on everything, but it takes a huge emotional toll. And so it's important to monitor your health and the health of those around you to make sure that everyone's coping in a healthy way. Now, we do provide mental health resources and links to mental health resources within our workbooks and on our website, and Mickey's posted that in the chat as well. But we also promote this Do More Agriculture Foundation, and what they are is they're champions for mental health in agriculture in Canada, and they have tremendous resources as well. So we do have a link on our website that you can click and visit them, and we're actually going to be offering a webinar on November 15th on mental health and building resiliency together that we're partnering with Do More Agriculture on. So we encourage you to register and come take part in that. And if November 15th doesn't work for you, then we are going to offer it again on January 17th and March 21st. So a couple of take-home messages just to kind of wrap up our time together is just to know that emergencies and serious animal disease outbreaks, they can impact you, they can impact your neighbors, and they can impact your industry. And they don't have to happen necessarily on your operation for you to feel the impacts of them. And so it's important for that reason to work through these what-ifs and anticipate those things so that you can not only take steps to prevent and mitigate, but you can also begin planning and preparing for these different scenarios that could occur. And so that you're better able to position your operation to respond more quickly. And hopefully by doing that, you can contain and limit a spread of a disease or minimize the impact to your operation. I guess, we also want to highlight that there are steps you can take to help minimize those impacts. And this is doing things like becoming familiar with those disease signs and symptoms and practicing good biosecurity and traceability and developing that on-farm emergency response plan so that when something happens, you're ready to go. I do want to make a note to promote the Squeal on Pigs. If you happen to see feral pigs, wild boars that are on your property, please contact the Ministry of Alberta, and there's some information here that you can use. And these are spreaders of disease potentially, and can cause problems. So just check out that program and be aware of it. But at that, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. And I hope that you have enjoyed our time together and that you have a better appreciation for preparing for emergencies in your sector and assessing the value of your emergency readiness. We hope that you'll check out the resources that we have available on our website and take steps to plan and prepare your operations for those unexpected events. I also really want to thank Brad and Jennifer for joining us today and making themselves available. They have firsthand experience with this, and we really appreciate you speaking from the perspective of government. And I want to give you a chance just in a wrap up here too. Is there anything you'd like to add, Brad or Jennifer, before we close?
The only thing I would add is that not all diseases are as nasty as foot and mouth disease. In Alberta, we've got anthrax and tuberculosis, which run around in different parts of the province. So we get worried, and we saw this at the front of avian influenza. Nobody wants to be first, but sometimes it just happens, right? Diseases search you out and grab you. So don't be afraid to at least reach out to your association. They are going to be a source of information, maybe not right away, but as we go through the event response or the disease response, they will be your intimate knowledge and your lobbyist for things that aren't working for you. So use them and use them well.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Jennifer, anything you'd like to add?
No, I'm going to be reaching out to Ashley and hopefully provide some premises identification. There was a little bit of a chat of the concern of getting registered, and it doesn't take very long. And the importance of being in there is very helpful with response and such. So we'll do what we can to support.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for the chats that's happened. Yeah, I agree. Let's hope we never have to go through this, for sure. That would be awful. So I know you can't see it here, but I have a wooden desk and I keep touching wood just to do my part, I guess, as far as suspicion goes. Is there any questions that anyone would like to have? I'll open the floor up to you right now and give you a chance to take opportunity to ask any questions of Brad or Jennifer or myself. I can give it a moment, and even if you want to ask questions through the chat. And if you think of questions later on, this is our my contact information, and you can always reach out to me, and I can pass questions along to Brad and Jennifer as well. But even reach out to Ashley, and she knows how to contact us as well, and can get those questions forwarded on as well. But if there is no questions, again, thank you very much for your time this evening. I hope you've had some takeaways from this, and we would be happy to talk to you again. Okay, we have a question here. If a big disease would happen in the middle of a feedlot alley, would sheep be included? I think it would depend on the disease. Yeah, if it impacted sheep, then you would be included in that. So a foot and mouth disease scenario, that would definitely impact sheep. Brad or Jennifer, anything to add to that?
TB is another one. What the initial disease response will do is figure out the affected species, because every variant of a disease is a little bit different. So they'll determine on the testing which exact type of disease is this and what are the species that are at risk and need to be followed up on. So if you've either had contact with that infected farm or you've got a fence line that borders, then you'll get a visit from one of the government vets.
And I would add to that too, that if you're getting feed delivered and it's going through a control zone, there is paperwork that has to be affected if it's deemed that maybe it's a vector of spreading something. So even if it wasn't applicable to sheep, like say with the avian influenza, if a truck is going through a primary control zone and it's visiting another place with chickens, there's a lot of paperwork that can potentially be there. So knowing if you are in a control zone will be huge.
Yeah, for sure. I hope that helps. Any other questions? Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Ashley.
All right, well, thank you to you, Shauna, and to AFAC as well, who partnered on this webinar with AHEM, and to all of our participants who joined us this evening. This will conclude the webinar. I will be sending an email to everyone who registered for tonight's session. That'll include the link to where you can access the webinar recording. And just again, to touch on Shauna's comment, if there are any questions, you know, you can always send them to her, you can send them to me, and we'll make sure that you're getting the answers that you need.